Okay, we're carrying on with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the third of our social contract theorists. And as I indicated last week, a major intellectual figure in the modern understanding of politics, who's bequeathed a sensibility and a way of weighing things up and looking at things to do with political life, which radically change anything that comes before it. We recall when we looked at Hobbes and Locke, we said they, in different ways, they contribute to the founding of a liberal understanding of politics. Rousseau has aspects of him which can be seen as liberal, but he has also more radical aspects of him which become developed through socialist ideas. And in many ways, especially through his critique of property, Rousseau can be seen as one of the earliest socialists, even though to call him a socialist would be a misnomer. You might recall me saying what he actually favoured was small-scale communities. His ideal, in terms of what had actually existed, was really the Spartans. So he liked the idea of smaller communities in which people were actively involved in contributing to political life. Now, and in a sense, this is primarily the way Rousseau saw freedom. Actually, there's something else that needs to be said, and that comes out of the general Enlightenment view, in which we recall that the initial thing driving the show was an attempt to understand the mechanisms of nature and the laws of nature to which we were bound. And Rousseau defines freedom as being the ability to give ourselves laws which we obey. That is, in a sense, to break free from the constraints of nature. But as we will see, there's this oscillation, tension, some people call it a contradiction, that is deeply in Rousseau. Because on the one hand, Rousseau constantly appeals to sentiment, that is, natural drives of being human. He considers them, though, through their socialization. So he recognizes society changes our nature. But at the same time, he is looking at freedom in such a way it's not being governed by our nature. So what's it being governed by? It's being governed by our love of virtue, by virtue. And the philosopher Immanuel Kant will take this further in a metaphysical direction and provide a way of arguing in which anything that is a law to which we could universally agree and submit to, what he calls the categorical imperative, that is, it's a command, an imperative, that's categorical because it applies to all. And he constructs that, and it is a construction, as being something that must not in any way, shape or form be impeded by our sentiments. And that even includes love. So this is, in a sense, a great faith in human rationality is what Kant will come up with. Whereas Rousseau, as I said, he's much more equivocal here because he sees, for example, that one of the most elemental qualities of being human that we can observe in the noble savage, even though he makes up that very idea of the noble savage, is that there's a certain degree of empathy. There's a certain sensitivity to anyone else's suffering. And that's, in fact, that's how Rousseau positions himself as someone who has understood the entire suffering of humanity. And he sees that suffering as caused by our social systems, the social conditions, which he believes have all been based upon force, irrational, unvirtuous qualities. And to get to virtue then means breaking with tradition. And I think I may have mentioned last week, in this respect, Rousseau presents himself as a kind of new Adam. And it's the beginning of an attempt to reconstitute what human beings are through reconstituting the social system. And this idea of the new man is something that we'll find again and again in the narratives of some communist thinkers. You'll find it in Mao Zedong, for example. You will find it in other Marxists. This idea we're creating a new man. You can see it in Trotsky. And the idea is very much in Marx as well. At one point, Marx will say, up to now we've only lived in a state of prehistory. Now history proper will begin. And what does that mean? That means when we have the liberty to do as we will and obey our species being, we'll talk about Marx next week, I think it is, but when we look at our species being, a real nature as opposed to the terrible circumstances that have afflicted us, then we will see what we can really do. So freedom becomes a really important concept. We can see it's very normative. And we recall that Locke had also talked about rights in a very normative way, whereas Hobbes had argued that rights is something that simply evolved out of the natural condition and necessity. So there's this kind of split. The philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Hegel, will later talk about the modern self as being a divided self. And I think that's a very astute insight into the kind of thinking that has occurred with this bifurcation between the natural condition and the normative rules, or what Rousseau will later call the general rule, which we'll look at in a moment. So freedom is central. It's not the only thing, because we'll also look at equality is central. And you will recall, again from last week, that Rousseau's famous sentence is, man is born free, but everywhere he is in change. In fact, of course, that's just crazy. We're not born free. We're always dependent. The baby is dependent upon nourishment from the mother in the first instance, in the very first instance. Now, insofar then as Rousseau thinks that it's been force and imposition, inequality that have governed the human species since the development of private property and beyond, he argues that force does not create right. But this is an interesting thing, and let's get this over and done with from the beginning, because in a way, it's an idea that runs throughout the entire system of Rousseau, and it leads to critics saying that there's something deeply illiberal in Rousseau's thinking, in spite of the importance of liberty within the system. For Rousseau does believe it might need to be the case that people must be forced to be free. That if they have not been sufficiently educated, if they don't know their own interests, then, and they opt for this feeling, for this condition of servitude, then that is something that defies all sense of human dignity. So this idea of human dignity also becomes an intrinsic part of the way we think and speak. And again, it'll be Immanuel Kant, who loved Rousseau. There's a famous story about Immanuel Kant that he used to take a walk at the same time every day. But the day that Rousseau's Emile came, the whole town knew something was up because he didn't take his walk. Okay. So for Rousseau, what this freedom means initially is that no man has any natural right over his fellows. And up until now, conventions have formed the basis of all authority. Freedom is inalienable. So the words slave and right contradict each other. To renounce liberty is to renounce being a man. And I mentioned that freedom consists in power to give ourselves the law, in a sense to leave behind our natural state and enter into a state of virtue, which is, again, being governed by itself in a sense. It's autonomous. Virtue governs itself. Our ideas will govern us. And I would say this as well. This is the beginning of a very idiocratic, the idea that ideas are central to the formation of social building and to the fabric of political society. Whoa. Okay, sorry. So his most famous, and it's a very short book, his most famous book of political philosophy is a little book called The Social Contract, or The Principles of Political Right. And Rousseau says the problem is to find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. So here you see an opposition set up. The opposition between the collective and the individual. Now you recall with Aristotle, for example, Aristotle argued that the collective must take primacy over the individual. And in fact, up until liberalism, that was always the case. But with the liberal thinkers, the idea that we contract ourselves into society ultimately means there's something that the individual desires to make him enter into the society, and the consequence of that, which will be important in the narratives that feed into the French Revolution, is if someone can make the claim that they would never enter into that society, then there is something amiss or remiss with that society. So the balance has to be right between the rights of the individual and the collective. Now, collectives as we know them, of course, have evolved historically. Collectives, as we've emphasized throughout the course, have required certain obligations and duties of each of its members. And we will also recall that as the French Revolution occurs, and this was the point we made when we spoke about Montesquieu, that many of the functions which gave certain privileges to the upper classes had originally developed out of duties, out of obligations. And the biggest one, of course, I've mentioned a couple of times now, being that the original authorities working with the crown, they had that authority because they were prepared to gather arms, summon arms, and prepared to die. This, of course, now goes. What we've got is the idea of a community as a collective that is formed by your own reason. So it's in deep defiance of history. This is why I think when we consider his idea of the social contract and the noble savage, we have to say there's not much history in it. And the reason is because the way he's working is he's working with principles. He's working with principles and ideas. And the idea of freedom and the idea of equality are the twin pillars of the Rousseauian vision. And in fact, I would also say that freedom and equality provide the fundamental source of the modern imagination's political will. So, although we had seen the idea of equality in Hobbes and Locke, it was really nothing like Rousseau, because they hadn't dealt with the obvious fact, the palpable fact, that there is a class structure within the society. And Rousseau is really onto that, because he was very unusual in that he didn't come from the upper class. He was basically a person whose low birthright, unlike someone like Montesquieu, for example, low birthright, but talent had been central to his whole life trajectory. And yet he mixed with people of higher classes, and they were enthralled by him. It reminds me of when, in a different kind of way, but when Marie Antoinette used to play in Versailles, play the idea of the shepherdess. And that kind of thinking, or that kind of behavior by her, was in many ways a consequence of the kind of narrative that Rousseau himself was projecting. You know, the ideal of the simple life, and that we should not look down upon those beneath us because they have something about the human spirits which becomes lost as civilization develops. So, what we have here also is a very constructivist approach. That is, it's constructed by a human imagination, or reason, the understanding of things, working with certain principles and concepts. And this is then going to form the basis of the contract. And of course, the very idea of a social contract has already lent itself or tended towards that direction. So each of us puts his person, this is from Rousseau, and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and in our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. There is no whole without our indivisible participation within it. In order then that the social compact may not be an empty formula, it tacitly includes the undertaking which can alone give force to the rest, that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. And that's a point I'm making here. This means nothing less than he'll be forced to be free, for this is the condition which, by giving each citizen to his country, secures him against all personal dependence. So there's a recognition, Locke could also recognize this, that you can't simply be free as the way Hobbes presented it in The State of Nature, just to seize and take what you want, because that is at the expense of someone else's freedom. So you see, you need some kind of means of adjudicating how freedom is to be allocated. And that is the whole purpose of political life. So note, there's two things here. You need harmony, you want harmony, and you need a harmonizer. But the harmonizer can only act in accordance with what those seeking harmony bestow to them. That is, again, it's a very unhistorical. It is elevating the primacy of the human will. And it was Martin Heidegger, the great 20th century German philosopher, and I may have said this before, who identified the will as the central fulcrum, or as a fulcrum of modern metaphysical thought. So what we have here is definitely a metaphysics of politics, and it's one in which the will is elevated. Normally, if you think of the will, if you think of it in everyday life, it's simply what you want to do. It's a capacity to go, I want that, I don't want that. I want this, I don't want that. But philosophically, we will see, we're going to speak about Fichte a bit later in the day. We will see how willing for Fichte is at the center of a person, of a community, of a nation. That's all coming out of Rousseau. But Rousseau himself, in a sense, is caught up in this metaphysics of modernity, which begins with Descartes. But he's taken it steps further by the way he's made society itself something that is going to be dependent upon our will. There is also, remember me saying just a few moments ago about how Rousseau really venerated Sparta. And one of the things, of course, about the Greeks and the Romans was that religion was all part of a civic tradition. That is, the religion and the public sphere were intrinsic to each other. So in a sense, it's pre-Reformation, what Rousseau was thinking about. But at the same time, it's also very datist. He's not, strictly speaking, very personally religious. It's not a personal matter at all. But he's looking for some kind of glue. Again, I can think of Machiavelli, you know, where he talks about the importance of the gods to the Romans and the importance of rites and rituals. And so in this sense, this is how Rousseau sees religion. We need something to have faith in that will be a source of common faith, but it really has very little to do with any biblical antecedents or any the Jewish way of thinking, the Christian way of thinking about life. And politics becomes a kind of end in itself. I think the ideal day for Rousseau would consist of either being left alone and being without any human beings, but when he's in a group, what they'll be speaking about, what would be the common good and what should we do. Of course, there's only, the larger the society is, the more impossible it is for that kind of enterprise to exist, because you've got so many resources to extract, so many tasks to perform. The sheer scale of it mitigates against that having any meaning. And to be fair to Rousseau, and I think Marx never really gets this. He doesn't really, or if he does, he just leaves it to one side in a very, I think, unsatisfactory way. Rousseau recognizes that this requires small-scale communities. And he wants also, and this is very unusual at the time, because he's not ignorant of the political economic discourses that were being circulated at the time. He realizes this requires small-scale production, and he even wants to tax any kind of luxury goods. So he wants to ensure that the community doesn't privilege or doesn't seek things that are ultimately corrosive to the political spirit and the civic body. And in this, again, he's also like Machiavelli. I'm just emphasizing that because, we said Machiavelli in many ways can be said to be the first modern political scientist. Rousseau is deeply suspicious of the commercial spirit. Now, there's a great irony in that. I'll probably point that out later, but I might as well say it now. The great irony in that is that one of the driving forces behind the French Revolution was that people involved in commerce, or that class of people involved in commerce, as well as others in professions, but let's just focus upon commerce. One of their reasons for opposition to the crown, to the state that existed at that time prior to the French Revolution, is that it did not enable them to express their points of view, which would further enable their own development and their own social development. So here we have Rousseau, this great paradox. He's so against one of those forces that will be really important in the French Revolution, and yet he is also used against the aristocracy as a kind of battering ram against any kind of privilege. He also recognizes, and again some people see this as a contradiction or as a paradox, the importance of the lawgiver. So he, for example, he speaks on one occasion at least, about Moses, the importance of someone who is able to lay down the law. So here you have this thing. On the one hand, the law is the expression of what we want. On the other hand, you need a legislator able to deliver what is most important. And basically, whether you're a Rousseauian or not, a lot of it depends upon what you think of that paradox or contradiction, whether you think it's doable. Or in other words, whether you think that the legislator within the collective body has now got all manner of opportunities for tyranny, or whether you think that the legislator is really always acting on the best behalf of the community. And let's underscore something I just said previously as well. And let's compare this with Montesquieu. The way Montesquieu conceives of politics was very much that it is an activity of mediation between interests. It's not an activity that requires the dissolution of interests. And in fact, someone like Montesquieu thinks that that would be an impossible request because the interests simply are bound up with the division of labour, the role you're playing socially, and as that develops historically, that is going to lead to all sorts of demands and requirements for your self-perpetuation. What Rousseau is saying is this can all be harmonized. So politics, in a sense you could say, in the Rousseauian sense, is actually a kind of anti-politics. If politics is about mediating between interest groups in which the interest groups will not be dissolved and the interests cannot be dissolved, Rousseau is about finding some way in which those tensions will cease to exist. And in this respect, I think this is why Rousseau is such an important precursor of the modern radical imagination, And you will recall me talking about Rabelais, another Frenchman, in the Abbey of Vilaine, who had talked about, I think I did in this class, but I know I did in the other class that most of you do, so, that there is a kind of unity of purpose for the collective, which in the case of the Abbey of Vilaine is a very small group. But as I said, Rousseau ultimately wants small-scale societies. And in part, that's, part of his heritage, if you like. He's come out of Geneva. And he says Geneva was really just one of the best places politically that exists today. This is really, this gives us a kind of model for what we should be working towards. Though it's even smaller scale, I think he ultimately wants, and much more rule-based. Now, when we looked at Hobbes, the big issue was that sovereignty was being transferred as a kind of deliverance from the horror and the chaos of existence in the state of nature. When we look at Locke, we also see a transference of sovereignty because he recognizes that no one can be a judge in their own case. And note that, no one can be judged in their own case. Ultimately, the way Rousseau conceives of political authority, political obligation, and political sovereignty is that is exactly what is maintained. That you remain a judge in your own case because you're ultimately judging the collective through yourself, through your own will, but there is a big ask of the will. And this sets up, and again, a kind of thinking, I mentioned Immanuel Kant with the categorical imperative, a kind of thinking that really takes hold of the modern radical mind. And there was a very famous book, which in some ways is said to be, or in many important ways, is said to be to have reignited political theory. And that's a book by John Rawls in 1972, I think it was, called A Theory of Justice. And it's so Rousseauian because it does exactly the same thing. It just wants to keep that of, you don't really give up anything, but in a sense you also give up everything. That is, you give up everything that is an interest that's personally yours, but you maintain the idea of the voluntary power of your ability to conceive where the harmony would be. And then you have to submit to that. So, bringing this back to sovereignty, whereas Locke had said the sovereignty is devolved, but it's representative government, so it can be recalled, Rousseau says the sovereignty is never devolved. Here we see this idea of harmony. So the individual and the whole, they're all of a piece. There is a concordance there. I think this is just words, by the way. I think this is just rhetorical. I don't think it's remotely sustainable. But it's up to you what you think about that. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm just telling you what I think there. So the power may be transmitted, but not the will. Which means, if you have some constitutional type and a government based upon Rousseauian principles, if the legislator can argue that what they're doing is for the general good, it's part of what we will call the general will, I'll get to that in a moment, then to oppose it would simply be wrong. Again, I think you should be able to smell the totalitarian tendencies in that. Because the big question is that possible? Is that desirable? So we have this also an indivisibility of sovereignty. So whereas, for example, what we're watching in American politics right at this very moment, this contestation going on between the judiciary, or the representative of the judiciary in the form of William Barr, and the Congress is led by the Democrats, you're having this exactly the kind of situation being played out that the founders of the American Republic had attempted to deal with, and that is that you must have some kind of separation. or dispersal of powers. Again, recall Montesquieu had talked about the separation of powers and saying it existed in England. Look, and as I pointed out then too, let's take this in a pretty loose sense. Don't take it too strictly, because at some point these powers need to come together. But in the case of Rousseau, what you really don't want is any way in which sovereignty can be divided. And if you have different blocks of government able to be against each other, this gets rid of the whole idea underpinning the show, which is, to repeat, a principle and a set of principles. So it's a very legalistic, you could say, a very legalistic constitutional way based in a certain constructivism involving the rational mind, in which certain things are selected and other things just left to one side, or just kept out of the picture. This is the source of unity. So it's unity through principle, harmony through a general will, a common will. It also means that the general will is infallible. Now, to understand this idea of the general will, we also need to bear in mind a very important distinction that Rousseau makes, and that's the distinction between the general will and the will of all. You recall me saying earlier about, Rousseau's ideal with people coming and talking about politics. What's good for the community as a whole? And it's a kind of intellectual game that is required. That is, the game is that when we talk, we'll speak about the common good as if we were in a position to have an understanding of it or have some rational grasp of what it may mean. And then we may discuss this, but when it comes down to the vote, what we should be voting upon is not our personal interest, but the common interest. And here's the question, is that even possible? Is that even possible? Or is it the case? And I think the intelligentsia, one reason I think they're very attracted to Rousseau or Rousseauian types of solution and often talk in very Rousseauian ways about the public good is because I think they see themselves, because they trade in ideas and narrative, as being able to see that and in many ways being able to direct other people towards that. Against that, a more suspicious mind, like my good self, would argue, well, they're really seeing things through their point of view, and there's really no way around this. And when we look at Friedrich Nietzsche, who talks about perspectivalism and the will to power, I'll develop that idea further, that Nietzsche's a much more suspicious figure about the way that politics is being played out. But as I mentioned earlier, you don't have to be a Nietzschean to think like, say, Montesquieu did, just to say, well, there's certain interests, and those interests are simply a manifestation of how one reproduces one's own daily life. And very few people are going to say, look, for the common good, I think I should dissolve myself economically and just leave the game. I'll just give up what I'm doing. It's not good. That's highly, highly unlikely. So, the will of all would simply be pulling together an amalgamation of personal interests or the requirement that we eliminate private interest. So when we come to vote, we're trying to get a virtuous society, and what the Rousseauian is really relying upon is your use of virtue. So what happens if you don't have people acting that way? What if they're not really giving up? I've suggested they can't, but let's just say that by choice they don't do it. How do you deal with this? And I don't think Rousseau has much of an answer to that, if any answer to that. Or if there is an answer, it's this. So let's say this is a kind of an answer. And it's a kind of an answer that we see also reproduced by Marx, and I would say by others of the Rousseauian tradition. You must educate people. You need to help people to see what that common good would be and what their own virtue would be and their own will would be. And which great player or important player in the French Revolution should you immediately associate that with? Virtue, the primacy of virtue, a republic of virtue. Does that ring any bells? Robespierre. And his little psychopathic mate, Saint-Just. Robespierre adored Rousseau. So, I think education becomes important. Now, let's just emphasize that modern political life, modern societies, as I've said before, a number of times now, being idiocratic, that is, predicated upon ideas and the legitimacy and quality of ideas, inevitably requires education. It's also required simply in the tasks that are to be performed. You need an educated workforce. You need an educated community. You need people capable of appreciating and taking a stand on the different political ideas that are in circulation. So again, you need literacy. You need to be schooled. You need to be trained. You need to be inducted. And I don't think it's any accident that modern societies, through their education systems, emphasize things like excellence and virtue as intrinsic to our social development. I think this is all a kind of spin-off from Rousseau. So I don't want to give the impression I'm just being critical of this, that it's just that. But the problem, as I keep coming back to, is when it comes time for people to decide about the nature of the general will, who will do it, who has the capacity to do it, and can it be done? This is why Rousseau is simultaneously considered, take your pick, a radical Democrat. So the whole idea of political parties, which is something that develops after Rousseau, the whole idea of representative government, in which you basically have someone who then goes and thrashes stuff out with the political party, they work out a platform and then they give you a choice. That is in many ways antithetical to the whole spirit of radical democracy. And all radical Democrats in the Rousseauian, Marxian tradition are very skeptical of that modality of governance, which they associate, quite rightly so, with liberalism. But they see that as flawed because it doesn't reflect the general interest. The question is there such a thing as the general interest? Except in a very broad, very, very, very broad parameters. I mean, you know, we speak about things like women's interests, but women don't all agree. You know, if they have a religious background, a traditional background, they're going to view abortion very differently. They're going to view all sorts of things very differently. Again, Rousseau, I think, is part of that enlightened tradition that thinks if we can just carry people along through education, then they will see the right way, and we can have a republic of virtue eventually. The critics of radical democracy say not only that it can't be done, it says that using this kind of narrative actually conceals personal interest. So it's not only that it's impossible to dissolve faction and interest, it's that a narrative like this papers over it, so those groups that are most forceful in seeking their way and seeking the society to serve their interests, educators, for example, as economic agents, they will look for institutional opportunities where the things they do, the reason they get up in the morning, go to work, blah, 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 the things they love doing, will be rewarded so that they can have more and more authority and the world conform more and more to their interest. That is, you could say it's a problem of articulation. Whoever is articulating the general interest is ultimately going to be doing it in such a way, and this is inescapable, that a particular interest is now being presented as if it's for the good of all. So you're really supporting a whole range of offices, opportunities, a place in the world, which also involves having political authority. You're devolving stuff over to them. So they see this as a very contradictory. And there's a very famous book that was done, I think it was in the 1950s, it might have around that time, by a guy called J.L. Talman, T-A-L-M-O-N. And it was called The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy. It may have even had Rousseau in The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy, but that was the central thing. So the idea of radical democracy is really just a totalitarian occasion. So the other thing that's closely related to this is that Rousseau has substituted morality for politics. He's made them equivalent. And living, conflicting communal processes have now been developed along lines of geometrical principles. And this was a criticism that was aired, and it's not developed at great length, but it's just said on a couple of occasions in the book by Edmund Burke called Reflections on the Revolution in France. Burke was quite an interesting man. He's often considered to be the first modern conservative. And Burke argued that communities are organic, that they are grounded in prejudice. And he says, prejudice, don't understand prejudice as meaning, an ignorant set of assumptions and proclivities about what you want. He said, no. Prejudice is habit. Prejudice is a habit that often takes multiple generations of formation, because what is happening, you see, is really a creation of Montesquieu, and he liked Montesquieu very much. What is happening is there's all sorts of information that is being gathered and developed according to your social position, economic position, whatever, and this is how you make your way in the world, and ultimately all of this is what constitutes a society. So anything that is based upon a more geometrical application of principle, by geometrical I just mean, you set up the principle and you develop a chain of reasoning behind it, as if it were like a geometrical problem. And you might recall Spinoza had used this geometrical principle. He had spoken of his work, The Ethics, being a geometrical form of analysis. So Burke presents a very antithetical position to Rousseau. Now, I said Burke was a conservative, but Burke also supported the American revolutionaries. So his position is is not so easily dismissed as simply being conservative, because he thought when things are really genuinely wrong, or where there are circumstances such as in this new world, and the crown is this far away, and he goes into, what's wrong with England trying to still control the colonies in the way they were doing. He's quite open to change, so he's not against change as such. But he was writing before the terror at the time of the French Revolution, and he believed that the narrative driving it would inevitably be fuel violence. He thought it would inevitably be very violent. And Thomas Paine, also a British guy who lived in America and then spent time in France, had written a book very critical of Burke, The Natural Rights of Man, where the way Paine tells the story is this will just evolve its rights, this is the way it should be, you know, you've got no reason to think that things are going to be so bloody and so dire as you suspect. And again, one of the things that come out of this, which is also very Rousseauian, is the very modern idea which is repeated and comes out of in narratives throughout the French Revolution, is the condition of humanity at its natural condition, you know, the natural condition of humanity. Is it, as the Christian said, evil? Or is it fundamentally good? Or Rousseau says it's fundamentally innocent because it hasn't had the opportunity yet or the occasion for virtue. But it would be were it not thwarted by all these systemic wrongs which occur in commerce, and, you know, we benefit from each other's misfortunes, as Rousseau in the modern commercial world. You know, a boat sinks and therefore the insurer may have to pay out some money to someone, or maybe they don't have to pay out some money. You know, they're lucky that everyone's on board the boat, whatever. Okay. So, if we look at the French declaration of the first Declaration of the Rights of Men, we can see Rousseau and Montesquieu's influence. And there's a big tension. And as the revolution develops, you can see that ultimately this constitution will be torn up and it will be replaced by an even more radical one that the Jacobins come up with, and then the third one which starts to taper things back quite a lot. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. Rousseau. Article 2, the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and prescriptive rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. A lot of Rousseau there. There's also some Locke there with property. The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority that does not proceed directly from the nation. Again, very Rousseau. And what we know about the French Revolution, of course, is that mode of governance simply led to faction. So in spite of all the unity of purpose and the documentation around, faction was part and parcel of it. A society in which the observance of the law is not abused, nor the separation of powers defined, has no constitution at all. There's Montesquieu as a kind of reaction to that, or a modifier of that. And yet, as the revolution unfolded, what happens, we see the Committee of Public Safety set up, which then becomes, in a sense, exactly a dictatorial source for the so-called preservation of the democracy. Now, there's lots of other reasons behind that, you know, the wars, etc., the federalists, the problem of federalism versus unity of state, and all of that. Montesquieu would also be an important influence upon the fathers of the United States government, especially the Federalists. But as I mentioned earlier, Rousseau's conception of virtue as civic duty would certainly influence Robespierre, and his critique of private property would also feed into the more socialist wing that emerges out of the French Revolution, including Gracchus Babeuf and his Society of Equals. So, summing up these paradoxes, he would become a darling of some aristocrats, certainly a darling of the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie also understood as always to be the professional classes. But he opposed the advancement of commercial society. This was also something, again, that troubled Robespierre. Robespierre didn't just want to see France become a major commercial nation like Great Britain. That would have been a disaster for his period. He favoured small-scale societies and the closed luxury, would help establish the rule of the bourgeoisie. He loved mankind. He saw liberty as in purely political terms, and emphasized the complete authority of the community, yet he himself, he writes, Reveries of a Solitary Walker. I think I mentioned this before. He saw theatre as morally corrupting, but wrote plays and opera, for a critique of his for his critique of the toxic character of modern entertainment, which has got, you know, some really true insights into it. You read his letter on D'Alembert, but he also wrote a play called Narcissus, which was actually performed to the king, if I recall rightly, in the 1750s. And later in life, he wrote a preface, and it's a god-awful play. No one remembers it, and Rousseau dug it out and then wrote a preface to it. And the preface is really interesting because he says in the preface, "Look, I agree that theatre is a really pernicious thing. It's pernicious. It just entertains. It's frivolous. It corrupts social relations. It's not serious like political engagement. However, if people spend their time in the theatre, at least they're not doing something worse with their time. And they could be doing things far worse. So that's my justification for my theatre piece." And perhaps the biggest contradiction was that he wrote a book on how to educate, yet he farmed off all his children that he had with his mistress. And it is almost certain that the majority of them would have died, given the death rate in orphanages or the equivalent thereof in that time. Now, the reason I point that is not just to draw attention to troubles with Rousseau's moral character, but I think there's something about Rousseau, and one of the reasons I find Rousseau is so interesting, is that he is really a weather vane of what is happening with the modern. His contradictions are very much the contradictions of the modern. He's nostalgic, yet he wants progress. He accepts that there's arts and sciences and we can't really undo them. And he accepts, in a sense, the kind of benefits of civilization. He lives within it, but he's also highly critical of it. He wants community, but he wants isolation. He wants to keep squaring the circle, so to speak. But I think the main critical issue about modern men and women that I think replicates some of these paradoxes or contradictions of Rousseau is this disengagement in which you speak about things and you somehow magically disappear out of the picture of things. So you say the opposite of what you do. And I think there's a reason for this. And it comes back to what I've been saying about idiocratic societies. And the reason for this is quite simply, when you're running along with a set of reasons, you don't have to keep checking them back into what you're doing, into your life. It's a narrative. There's a flow. There's a rhetorical and metaphorical and expansive dimension to these. So the imagination can take flight. But actually, unlike, say, if you're making a painting or working on a specific thing that you have to concretize, the words trigger words, trigger words. And there's nothing more mesmerizing than political speech. I'll give you a very good example of that. There was a documentary made quite a long time ago now by one of the leaders of the student movement in the 1960s, a guy called Daniel Cohn-Bendit. I think I'm right, and I think it was Cohn-Bendit. If it wasn't him, it was another one of those figures anyway. So he was a 68er, and he was looking at the Red Brigade in one show. It was on Revolution. The series was on Revolution. It was put on SBS, as I said, maybe 30 years ago. And he interviewed a couple of people from the Red Brigade who had been responsible for the abduction and murder of Aldo Moro, who was the Prime Minister at the time for the Italian Christian Democrat Party. And they killed him. And when talking with them about this. They said what we really wanted, what we're really seeking, is to go and live in the countryside and have a peaceful life. And I thought, well, we didn't have to do that to go and do that. And another member of the Red Brigade said, when I start talking in this language about justice and equality and the things I want to achieve, and why we're opposed to capitalism, and why that meant we had to go and kill industrialists or agents of the state, it all makes sense. He says that there's something mesmerizing about this language, because once I start to get into it, I'm kind of hypnotized by it. What it actually has to do with my actual life, that's another thing altogether. And he's basically reflecting on the fact of, what have I done? So there's a mesmerizing quality of political narrative that, and in this sense, I think one of the things about Rousseau that cannot be said strongly enough is he is a fantastic orator. He's a great writer. And he keeps tapping in to these needs or dreams and a certain discontentment. Which is, in a sense, very much a part of the modern condition. You get the material stuff you want, and then you find you're spiritually lacking in something. There's still something missing. So perhaps virtue will fill that need. And there's many people today that think that, and are happy with it. Okay, let's have a short break, and then we'll come back and talk about nationalism. We're going to now talk about nationalism and national identity very briefly. It is interesting that the greatest theorist of nationalism of the 19th century is a German, and ultimately nationalism as a body is something that occurs before nationalism really has any strong theoretical framework for it. So much like with liberalism, we saw that you already had lots and lots of stuff in place before liberal theory develops. Nationalism is an important source of political solidarity, and indeed we can see that national identity is the proof of the pudding is in the very world that we look at. It's full of nation states. Though, as I also will emphasize, though we don't deal with this in this course, but we do in another course, that it's really hasn't taken root very well where the conditions have not been right for it, and that's particularly in the Islamic world, especially the Arab world. Okay, so now we see the world as largely divided into nation states, sovereign states. The CIA fact book listed 265 nations. I looked at it some years back. There might even be a couple more since then. There's 192 UN member states. Taiwan is not a UN member, but it sees itself as a nation state. States may come and go, though. National boundaries are constantly being redrawn, and it's always a great learning experience to simply go back and look at different maps over a period of time, and you'll just see how they do come and go, and nation states come and go. At the core of the idea of the nation is that there's some common sense of identity, a shared sense of history, often wars and revolution, a desire to share a common future. Benedict Anderson came up with a felicitous and very famous formulation. It was actually a book that he was writing about Indonesia, where he talked about a nation being an imagined political community. The question is, are the resources available to the members of that so-called community, of that nation state? Do they really exist? Do they share a common imagination? And I mentioned the Islamic world before, and one of the things that comes out of that, because you recall that a lot of states that form the Middle East were basically carved up. It wasn't only, but the Pichot-Sykes agreement during the First World War was when the French and the British got together and decided how they would carve up the remnants of the Ottoman Empire once it was defeated in the war. In the Western, and the idea of nationalism is very much emerges out of the West, even though in anti-colonial struggles it will be seized upon. And it will become a modality for organisation. But it's not only the problem of the Middle East, but in other parts of Africa, you can see that there's been constant problems because these elements are frequently lacking. They're frequently just simply not there. Now, change in demographics. Immigration can completely change the cultural identity. So the idea of there being a fit between a cultural identity and a nation is not unproblematic. Also, some nations, for example, Belgium or Switzerland, are very ethnically divided, and some of them, that division was very strong, so that there's not a strong sense, there's a very weak sense of nationhood for the Belgians, and there's little cultural unity, and no one would be surprised if Belgium one day ceased to exist. It would not be a big surprise. Others, like Switzerland, are very diverse ethnically, but there's a strong sense of nation and commitment to the nation. Also, when we speak of that ethnic and everything group, what we see is, well, there's all sorts of other peoples, an ethnic minority, some of which would like to form their own nation. Remember, Scotland had a plebiscite on this. It was very close, but it didn't get up, which saved me great embarrassment, because about 4 years before it occurred, but only about a year before it did occur, the book came out, and I'd written the chapter 4 years before, and I said, I can't see Scotland becoming a separate nation any day soon, because I didn't know that, that a Prime Minister would say, well, let's have a vote on this, like they did with Brexit as well. So, oh, God, I was crying on that one. That's more egg on my face than I need. So you've got all these various nations, some of these ethnic groups would definitely like to form their own nation. The Basques, for example, parts of Spain, the Catalonians, Galicia, but the Catalonians especially, there's been a lot of stuff occurring there a couple of years ago. So this idea of this ethnic unity, even in France where they had the revolution, the Bretons weren't really just like the rest of France, for example. So nationalism is something that is a reality that predicated upon lots of imagination, to go back to Emerson. So nationalism, what comes first? Nationalism of the modern state. Well, if we simply mean the nation, or we might say, well, we can find evidence of that. And Herman Cohen, who I actually cite here, Hans Cohen, sorry, who argues that nationalism is unthinkable before the emergence of the modern state, in his very important book, written somewhere in the mid-20th century, about nationalism, spends a lot of time talking about the Jewish nation and the Jewish people as a nation, even though there are people of diaspora, and how their identity is very much around their nationhood, even when they don't have the territorial unity and consolidation of that politically to be a nation state. So in this sense, and here I've given you a number of other various national groups that are seeking or fighting for statehood, and it's interesting that the Irish Republican Army has been involved in some activity again after that seems quelled. It seems to be a response to Brexit. So to have a nationality does not necessarily make one a nationalist. It's very interesting. I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine, a very smart young man, and he was German. And in the main, because of the German experience, most Germans think of nationalism as a really bad thing. Very understandably so. And he was making that case. And I said, well, that's not how the Scots see it. That's not how the Basques see it. You know, there's lots of people that don't see it that way. They don't see it as a bad thing. And when I get to Herder, you'll see why they don't see it, because I think he gives a very good rationale of a certain understanding of nationalism. So it doesn't have to have that that character where you use the nation. And I'm thinking now too of Hannah Arendt's really important book on totalitarianism, or the origins of totalitarianism, in which she argues that the success of the French Revolution had an extremely terrible effect on what would happen in Europe, and she sees that as really contributing to the persecution of the Jews in Europe, because again, we recall that France, it was the first country to give rights, civic rights to the Jews on that kind of scale. There might have been the odd principality that gave them some rights, but in the main, and then they weren't democracies at all. But she argued that once the nation instantiated itself as a state, that peoples like the Jews and others like the Gypsies could be seen as not really belonging to the nation, so they could be deprived of rights, because rights and nationhood tended to work in tandem with each other. I think that was a very important observation by her. So the usual features of a modern state, which I mentioned in the very first lecture: centralized organization, monopoly of violence, defined people, bounded territory, common culture, a sense of nation. But we see these are the usual features of it, but they're all a bit raggedy. So the modern state system really emerges out of the 16th century. I'm just drawing attention to the fact that the modern state system is very much a European response to a European crisis, and that crisis was the crisis of the 30 Years' War. But there had been roots of that preceded that, even in the 15th century, with monarchies in Western Europe and the Italian city-states. But the idea of the state as an entity in which there's a sovereign over its territory, and in terms of international law, they each have rights and you should leave each other alone. They have their separation of states and judicial obligations, and they shouldn't invade other territories. And that should take primacy over any perceived Christian duties, because the 30 Years' War, one of the reasons it broke out is because the emperor had wanted to win back territories, and indeed what was perceived as the stolen goods of Catholics as they moved, as some areas moved into Protestant sovereignty. And in Article 1 for the Treaty of Westphalia, this peace must be so honest and seriously guarded and nourished that each part furthers the advantage, honour and benefit of the other. So here's an idea of a community of nations, nation-states working with international law of some. Of course, it's a treaty. It's words. It doesn't mean a whole lot, but it feeds into the modern imagination, and certain territorial divisions start to ground themselves along these principles. The nation, I think, also, though, does require a cultivation of a common sensibility, and it is also inevitably going to be predicated upon a certain strength of economic unity of purpose. And this is why I've mentioned this character, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who has been called the first nation builder. And his ideas and influence have determined, indeed, the entire course of development of modern nation states, I think, since the Treaty of the Westphalian period. And this is a quotation from Pierre Baudry Colbert's system of nation building was based upon state-controlled industrial development, combined with closely selected and productive private initiatives. He looked at the nation as a farmer cares for his farm. The entire territory of France was meant to become the land where the common good was to grow unimpeded. He protected it, showered it with public funds, enriched it, and let other reap its beautiful fruits. This is very rhetorical, of course. He cultivated the common good by weeding out the privileges of aristocracy up to a point. He encouraged new industries and funded population growth by creating tax incentives and special bonuses for married couples. He was doing this all, of course, in the context of a monarchical state. He put protectionist barriers all around France against British, Dutch and Belgian dumping. In one word, Colbert became the champion of skilled labour and the sworn enemy of commercial aristocracy, which had been living off their privileges the feudal aristocracy had done during the past century. But those of you familiar with the history of France know there's a fair bit of idealisation gone in there. But the idea that you needed to build up, and central to this, is the role of the state in industrial development. I think that's very true. And the reason I want to emphasise this is we've been looking at the liberal tradition. And we saw that Rousseau is caught up in the problem of the individual versus the collective. When we look at Locke, we see that we've basically got markets and state. And state is there to protect people's properties, but there's the idea that the market is a place of rational cooperation, etc. In point of fact, it is, and this is why I quote this, the evolution of modern nation states in Europe is very much bound up with industrial growth, in which the state does play a very important directive role, especially in its early foundations. And indeed, the relationship between state and market is such that I think both the liberals and the Marxists are engaging in some strong degree of fantasy and thinking that they can be separate from each other, that they evolve in tandem with each other. Commercial society is predicated upon strong states plus market mechanisms. And the attempt to simply cleave that in two either leads, as it does in the Soviet Union with the economic basket case in the first instance, or a centrally planned economy which is able to do certain things but not very good at consumer satisfaction, dealing with consumer demand, entrepreneurship, and the kind of developments that commerce helps develop. Colbert had also set up the Royal Academy of Sciences for research for scientific and technological development that had the mission of creating innovations in specific areas of scientific activity. And again, to improve these things. Again, the state has to take on board certain tasks. And the relationship between the state and the market is such that if you fail to perceive the way in which they work symbiotically, and indeed, just one way you can, here's an obvious way that you see that symbiotic relationship. Lawyers generally, some are employed by the state, but generally they're operating within a market system. They put up their, this big legal company puts up its sign and attracts people to come work for it. And two areas of law, well, there's a whole realm of them, but I'll just mention two or three. I'll mention property law, contract law, and tort law. All of these ultimately have an impact upon legislation. So although the lawyers are private players in and of themselves, even if modern parliamentary system does have a whole swag of lawyers, and that's something that also was part and parcel of the French Revolution, having a very big percentage of lawyers involved in the making of it. What you've ultimately got is where the separation between the private and the public is ultimately quite impossible. There's all sorts of regulations needed around certain industry because they could be byproducts of what they do that will be harmful, and that has to be secured. They've got to make sure that the contracts are in order, etc. And then you've got company law and on it goes. So I think the state is something which ultimately also not only works with the market, but it also, in many ways, requires cultivation of citizenship. It requires education. It requires trying to foster a common spirit, because if that common spirit is too fractured, it will fall. And then you have the problem that Hobbes had realized of divided sovereignty, which is, for Hobbes, the worst thing that could happen. It was true that the French Revolution really was the most important, I think, instantiation of the idea of the principle of the nation. Again, it took a much more archaic sentiment, patriotism, and it projected it onto the nation, and the nation was coeval with the people. So the people were the nation. The problem, of course, though, as you know, is as the French Revolution unfolds, some people aren't really people. There's a great John Prine song, which actually uses that term. Some people ain't people. I'm a great fan of John Prine, and I think he's done that very nicely. And that was only possible with the liberation of the political consciousness of the Third Estate and their political involvement. But the nation is supposed to unite all its members. It has to have a common form. It's also the French Revolution that emphasized that the spirit of nation relies with geniuses. They are both the children and the cultural leaders of nation. And that's all part and parcel of having a common spirit. So it's not only a common language, it's not only a common ethnic group, but remember what I said, it's common symbols. It's common acts of genius which people can be grouped around to, again, have a sense of common bonds and solidarity. So the nation, the modern nation state and nationalism is a force for nation building, and it's a force to try and create cohesiveness. So there's all sorts of signs of a national consciousness. It can be a flag, a symbol. It can be the national anthem. You think of all these nation states throughout the world, we've got a beauty, haven't we, with the Advance Australia Fair. Must be a contender for the worst national anthem ever. Certainly the words are. But it includes things like literature, music, art, folklore, mythology, national religion, national heroes, national cuisine, national sport. There's all sorts of things that are taking place culturally which ultimately reinforce this. It was the French that, were very aware of the connection between the nation and its genius. And you might recall me saying elsewhere that one of the raison d'etre for the French Revolution, at least verbally, was that why should people who have genius, remember that great play of Beaumarchais, The Marriage of Figaro, why should people who have genius not be able to have political power when complete imbeciles and idiots who are part of the aristocracy just through nothing other than birth do have that power. So the French made a big thing of wanting to celebrate their artistic hero. And in this respect, they were followed by other nations. So it's only in the 19th century, for example, that there's a kind of decision made, I'm not sure exactly who makes it, that William Shakespeare, who had been forgotten for quite a time, his biggest revival was in the 18th century in Germany with thinkers like Goethe and Schiller just loving Shakespeare's play, translations of his work by the Schlegel brothers, very good translations, by the way, insofar as Shakespeare's able to be translated. He would become a symbol. Dante would become the symbol of unity of the nation of Italy. Goethe of Germany. They tended to have one. The French could never decide on one. Who's the greatest French person of literature? Impossible to answer. You know why? If you ask the French, they've just got too many. Just got too many. And it was Napoleon that really took revolution to Europe. Again, you might recall me saying in that other lecture that in the National Assembly, they were so wanting to export the revolution that Danton even says at one point. Yes, even the Chinese, yes, they will have their rebellion. They will form their own nation. So the view of these revolutionaries who had come out of their own experience of nationhood, their own sentiments about it, narratives around it, was that the world could be basically divided into all these national groups. And Napoleon believed, given that you've got autocracies all over Europe, the people will welcome me with open arms when I go to liberate them. Of course, Napoleon had an army needs to be fed. To feed them, you need to requisition stuff from the peasants who don't like stuff being requisitioned. Sorts of hostility. Some locations were much more open to being freed, like the Poles, who had a sense of national identity, had nothing in common with the Russians, but yet they had been usurped by the Russians. Others, like the Russians themselves, didn't want a bar of this. So there was varied responses to the Napoleonic imperial, because Napoleon would become an emperor. Was he a liberator or was he a conqueror? But undoubtedly, the ideas of nationalism nevertheless took seed. And they particularly took seed amongst the more educated elite. So it wasn't something that was from the bottom up. It was really, and that's why also that you will find the first national revolutions tend to be liberal in character. They tend to want some kind of constitutional, which means lawyers involved, constitutional framework in which the nation can be formed and in which its political duties and authorities can be allocated. Like liberalism, then, nationalism evolves as a reality and it's theorized somewhat retrospectively. And while France was the original modern nation with a consciousness of nationalism, it's interesting that the Germans, who were conquered by the French, they would become the important theorists of nationalism, even though that theorizing would begin even prior to that. But one of the figures who's very important is Johann Gottlieb Fichte, and his addresses to the German nation are given because of that conquest. So it's a reaction to that. However, I'll mention this character. He is undoubtedly one of my favorite thinkers. I love Fichte, and I've written a long chapter on him in a book I hope to publish. I'm not sure exactly when. I've got some other things to get off to get out, but I'm a great fan of Fichte. I'll tell you why. Fichte was incredibly curious, and he spent most of his life learning languages and discovering artifacts, works of art, texts, and reading them and writing about them from different peoples. And he saw that really what unites people, again, this imagination, this common imagination and a common sensibility, that has an aesthetic basis, what we feel. Aesthesis means, we sense something. So what we feel, that is triggered by great works of literature and great works of art. And these often have a very strong communally bonding character. And in his ideas for the philosophy of history, he basically saw the world through peoples and their artifacts. And his vision was such as that it was wrong for any other people to impose its spirit upon another people. And although, for example, he was a Republican, he pointed out that there's a real danger that the Europeans will seek to impose what are for its own characteristics and gains of freedom upon other peoples where there's not the cultural habitus for that to take root. So he was very aware of that. And he was interested in myths and stories, beliefs, folklore. And he's often been called one of the fathers of Romanticism. Now, remember, it was Enlightenment figures, it was the French that were pushing this idea of genius. But instead of it being an individual genius, he marries the genius with the nation and with the people. And he does it in such a way that he's mistrustful of the excessive faith in our ability to reason, which operates against or in defiance of this texture that we've developed, this cultural texture that we've developed, our aesthetic sensibility. Unfortunately, neither of these works are translated into English, but they're very good works. He was very critical of Immanuel Kant, who I've mentioned before. Kant being really influenced by Rousseau and Isaac Newton. They're the two great influences upon Immanuel Kant. And he is so critical of Kant's moral theory, his theory of knowledge, and his metaphysics, and his aesthetics. And it's a profound critique, and most people aren't familiar with it. But I think it's a very important critique. Herder was very widely read in his day in Germany, and he was also read outside Germany. But it would be wrong to claim that his ideas about nationalism had a great deal of political efficacy. Some perhaps in Germany, but certainly the kind of nationalism that he argued for was also bound up with the more cosmopolitan spirit, which is part and parcel of the Enlightenment as well. So basically the idea is you have a community of nations, each drawing upon its own spirit, each actualizing its own spirit in a social and political way, or social spirit in a political way, and then being able to meet as equals. And he basically, his method is always to say, if something existed a long time, there must be some good in it. That's the kind of argument Augustine gives, by the way. But there must be something good there. There must be something lovable enough, convivial enough about that for it to keep existing. So traditions have something in them that can't simply be dismissed in the way that Rousseau does. And you can't simply view societies in terms of oppression and oppressed, again, as Rousseau had done, or in terms of superstition and not superstition. In fact, that whole idea that the Enlightened philosophers had is that everything was superstitious until us. He wants no truck with that. And yet he's a very studious person. He's very philosophically well-read, literate, and he applies philosophy, but he applies it in this way that ultimately is both liberal and romantic, cosmopolitan and nationalistic, aesthetic and intellectual. You know, there's all these paradoxes that work. I would say it's also, he doesn't use this term, but I think it's a very dialogical way, and I'm very prone to that. I think that's a very helpful thing, because where people really differ, it doesn't mean they might be able to overcome the differences, but you won't know unless you see each other and hear each other. At least gives you the chance to try and merge into something beyond either of the positions that you're starting with, to become something different, which is the condition of any successful cooperation, by the way. Now, this character is much more important in terms of having a direct influence, and he had enormous influence in Germany. I'll say a couple of things about Fichte. First of all, as far as philosophers go, compared to Immanuel Kant or Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel or Schelling or any other German contemporaries of the time, he's dreadful. He's just dreadful. So what do I mean by that? If some people have read Fichte and they listen to this, they might be horrified at what I'm saying and might be rather angry with me for saying this, because this is the second thing I'll say about Fichte. I think there's few philosophers, Rousseau's definitely one, but there's few philosophers, I think, are such an interesting symptom of all the currents of the time. So when I say I think Fichte's a dreadful philosopher, what I mean is this. Fichte was a student of Kant, he read Kant, and he makes one really insightful and acute and true philosophical criticism. I'm not going to go into the details of this. I'll just say he makes one strong, acute criticism, which would be enormously influential. When I say it's dreadful, he repeats it 100 million times. He keeps writing over it, repeating it, on and on and on. And the idea is basically that the ego is the basis of reality. And I won't go into how he justifies it, but it's the self-postulating act of the I that makes the world. Now, one thing that I think he's done, which is a very good thing, so I'm qualifying already when I say he's a dreadful philosopher, when I say you read him and it's on and on and on and on and on, but there's some really important insights that he does have, and which was why he was so popular. He was also a very good orator, even though it doesn't wear very well in terms of today. But his lectures were widely attended, they were widely circulated. But the thing I think that he really does is he philosophically gives the strongest argument of that time, and perhaps of any time, in which we should see the world as simply the expression of our will in its consensual acts. And I say that importantly because we'll see other thinkers like Schopenhauer, I don't really talk about in this course, but Nietzsche I will talk about, also make the will pivotal in their thinking. But the way that he uses the will, unlike Nietzsche, when we look at Nietzsche with will, it's just purely force. The way Fichte uses the idea of the will through the self-postulating act of the ego is the will as basically setting up a kind of view of reality which requires that we adjust reality to conform to our will of it. We adjust reality. And in some way, shape or form, I think that's what Marx does, even though Marx, I don't know if he even mentions Fichte. But there's nothing would suggest that he would have any great affinity for Fichte. There was a Polish neo-Hegelian, I won't bother spelling out his name, who was very taken by Fichte. So that was in the circle, his ideas were still present. But in the main, that generation of which Marx was one, they basically looked to and then criticized a guy called Hegel, H-E-G-E-L, who was very critical of Fichte, who says, yes, you did this well, the critique of Kant's good up to a point, but this is everything wrong with you. And what he basically saw wrong was this idea of the will, of willful imposition. So the other thing about willful imposition is the ideal of the Fichtean type. It combines both a kind of moral consensus that you can give through reason, so he reproduces with his own spin on it the kind of philosophy that Kant does, but then he adds the idea of the heroic to that. So it's the idea of the hero of willful imposition plus a certain moral imposition. If you look at his works, just the names of them, the attempt at a critique of all revelation, so that's exactly what it says, so it sounded biblical, he got into a lot of trouble for that. A science of knowledge, which is the basis of his critique of Kant and his metaphysics. An essay on the determination of man, that's where we see the heroic stuff come in. The closed commercial state, and what we get there is the idea that the willful imposition also means that the social and economic structure of the society could form to what the community wills it to be. Again, you can see there's a kind of Rousseauian dimension to that. And then there's the address to the German nation, which is what we're going to focus upon. Okay. He had initially supported the French Revolution. He saw Napoleon as betraying the revolution. For Fichte, the Reformation was a confirmation of Germany's gift to the liberation of humanity, and in that respect he was not alone in seeing that the modern basis of liberalism really came out of the freedom of conscience that had been supported and directed against Rome, of course, that Luther had come up with. He wants to educate and cultivate the moral view of the nation, and he wants to bring the German nation into existence. And he says, we are therefore compelled by necessity to wish to mould men who are inwardly and fundamentally good. Rousseauian, innocence becomes good. Post-French Revolution or French Revolution, since it is through such men alone that the German nation still continues to exist. And what Fichte then does is he just comes up with this fantastically, and again, in the 19th century, this was really stirring up, especially the student movement, who, many of the students were opposed to Napoleon, because they wanted to be their own people. They wanted to be a people. And he speaks of the purity of the German people and language. And he engages in exactly the kind of nonsense that will weave its way through the 19th century, through the 20th century, and even through up to and including the National Socialists. Now, Fichte is hard to pin down politically. It would be wrong to simply say that he was a National Socialist. Yet he was a nationalist and he was a socialist. But he was also a real individualist. So again, these contradictions and paradoxes are in play. But at the same time, he's a fantasist. And there's no other word for it. And these kind of fantasies will be reproduced in the 19th and 20th century. Perhaps the most famous one in terms of the influence upon Hitler is Houston Stewart Chamberlain. I'll talk about Gobineau in a bit. It's a bit more complex. And even more famous, outside philosophical circles, but in musical circles, is Richard Wagner. And they start to have this fantastical picture of the German peoples. The German speaks a language which has been alive ever since it first issues from the force of nature, whereas the other Teutonic races speak a language which is movement on the surface only, but is dead at the root. I mean, what do you say to that? You might like that. Yeah! Well, you go, what? How do you prove that? What are you saying? And he's not interested in any kind of supplying any proof for this. It's kind of fantasy. All the evils which have now brought us to ruin of foreign origin, which at the time you're listening to it, you're looking at the French invasion by Napoleon, you go, oh yeah. Of course, it was only when united with German earnestness and influence on life that such evils were bound to bring destruction in their train. So, yes, we... given our good quality, our seriousness, these foreign influences have infected us. They've taken something that's basically good and they've transformed it into something bad. He certainly has a messianic view of liberation of humanity and the nation as a means to that goal. The German spirit will open up new shafts and bring the light of day into their abysses and hurl up rocky masses of thoughts out of which ages to come will build their dwellings. He's not really saying we need to go and conquer. So in that sense, it's not Hitlerite, but we need to preserve our purity. We need to get back to purity. And this is one of my favorite thinkers, Rosenstock-Huessy, writes a great book, and it's called I Am an Impure Thinker. Herder is an impure thinker. Herder's great teacher was a guy called Johann Georg Hamann. He's an impure thinker. So what do I mean by that? I mean, they're thinkers that don't look for purity of essence. Whereas Fichte is looking for something pure, which means you have to try and rid yourself of what is these accretions that have taken place over time. But you already can see how it's kind of mad idea because it is so idealist. It suggests that it is possible to undo what the cosmos has conspired in doing. Whoever believes in the eighth address, in stagnation, retrogression, the round dance, of which we spoke, or who sets a dead nature at the helm of the world's government, where he may have been born in whatever language he speaks, is non-German and a stranger to us. Okay, I think these things speak for themselves. I'll quickly just touch upon Renan, because I really don't think that theoretically nationalism has much going for it once you get past Herder. And I think when you look at the kind of things that Fichte was saying, you can see, yes, it's rhetorical. It may galvanize, but there's a kind of petulance and defiance of reality that's intrinsic to the whole to the whole narrative. Now, this guy, Ernest Renan, though, I think gives a better. Renan was very famous writer at the time. He'd written the life of Jesus. He's very much a man of his times, very anti-Christian, very nationalist. But he didn't see nationalism in the same way as Fichte did. He saw nations as souls, spiritual principles. So this is much more like Fichte. They're products of social capital, historical memory, shared impressions of victories and defeats, common loves and mourning. Race is not the defining characteristic of nation. For race is not a pure concept. And the nations of Europe have all been mixed. And this, of course, is something that starts to plague nationalists, is the mixing of races. Man is everything in the formation of this sacred thing which is called the people. Nothing material suffices for it. It's a spiritual principle. Profound complications. Spiritual family, not a group determined by the sacred few. That's very much directed at someone like Montesquieu or someone like that looks at. And there are a lot of people also talk about nation and national qualities, trying to understand these things in geographical terms. We have now seen what things are not adequate to the creation of such a spiritual principle. Namely, race, language, material interests, religious opinions, geography, and military necessity. What more then is required? And ultimately, what is more required is ultimately a common spirit. It's the intermingling of all these things, and they can't be compartmentalized. Now, there would be a whole slew of national revolutions. So it's obvious that the elites within these territories saw that their liberation was bound up, that is, their personal liberation was better bound up with national liberation than anything. And you've got to remember, too, that Europe is largely imperial structure. So this is also an anti-imperial set of sentiments, as well as a territorial desire to galvanize people. I won't go through them all. There's a whole list of stuff. And the 1848 revolutions were of enormous importance in changing the map of Europe. But the last thing I mentioned this about stateless people. I'll leave that alone. The last thing I want to bring up is the very point that Renan was reacting against. And much of the blame for this goes back to a character called Joseph Arthur Gobineau. He was a historian. His book on the Renaissance is still, I think, for its time, I think it was an important contribution. And he wrote a book called Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races. He was actually a correspondent and even a friend of Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote the great book Democracy in America. De Tocqueville was horrified by what Gobineau was writing. Now, Gobineau was not an anti-Semite, so at least there's one good thing in his favour. But he basically saw the human race as constructed by these different races, and he says there's the white, the black, and the yellow, and the top of the pyramid is the white race. And he's the beginning of a scientific application of ideas about race, which even influences someone like Charles Darwin, or who's coming to these ideas. So it's very much in circulation, and it will have a very pernicious history. And ultimately, when racist ideas merge with nationalist ideas, you've got that murderous concoction that will feed into things like National Socialism. So I just mentioned him in passing, but basically the short version of the story is what begins as essentially more liberalizing and liberal idea turns into its opposite. So the nationalist writings in the latter part of the 19th century, as we move into the 20th century, take on more and more of this racist, scientistic, the science, it's not very good science, but that's neither here nor there. It was widely believed There was belief in eugenics. And this was not only in nations like Germany. But you see all sorts of racist policies. The United States, of course, the United States were a slave society until, or parts of it were, until the 1860s. So you could see how someone like Gobineau has a welcome audience of, yes, that's the reason we've got to keep slaves in their place, is they're inferior. And we'll have some obligation to them, but they will also work for us. And it was also going to be, with colonization, there's another opportunity to take this range of thought and apply it. Okay. See you next week.